For those of you who don't know me, my name's Raglan, Maddox, and I come from the Mortality clan in the southeast corner of Papua New Guinea. And before I start, I actually just wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Cullen Nations, their elders past and present. And I also wanted to acknowledge the youth that are here today. I think the conference organisers have done an outstanding job engaging youth, and there's been some interesting Twitter feeds for young public health professionals out there. So I wanted to acknowledge them as they'll be the elders and leaders of tomorrow. I think Valerie's actually done a really good job in starting off this conversation. And so what I'm going to do is sort of use the same sort of framework and focus in on Australia and look at, as we spoke about, premature mortality among Indigenous Australians. As we can see on this slide, you can see across the x-axis we have the cumulative probability of death, and you have years of age. And this is just another way of highlighting some of the inequities that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people face. We know for a long time that due to things like the Close the Gap campaign, that there are some significant disparities there, and this is just another way of trying to unpack and understand those disparities. So I've used the age of 65, I guess, as the benchmark for premature mortality, for one reason being the life expectancy of Indigenous people in Australia being around 67 years of age. And you can see that Indigenous Australians, there's about 30% of Indigenous Australian people have passed away at that age, in comparison to around just under 10%, about 9% among non-Indigenous Australians. So a significant difference across the lifespan. When we look at that by sex, again, you can sort of unpack that a little bit, and you can see there are some slight differences between male and female. I won't look too far into this, but you can see that the intent of this slide shows that there are still significant differences by male and female. I'm also going to go probably a little bit too fast because, well, a couple of reasons. I think I've tried to jam too many slides and too much information into a very short period. And I know I want to try and leave some time for questions towards the end. We also looked at it by over time. And so I should also flag that we're looking at the Australian Bureau of Statistics births, deaths and marriages sort of data set. And so we could look at it from between 2005 and 2015. And if you squint a little bit, you can see some slight differences. But the overall concept is there hasn't been a large change in the last 10 or so years. So this slide, Valerie, I'm going to build on some of the work that Valerie spoke about earlier, and going to look at probability of death by income group. So as you can see in this nice dark thick line, Indigenous probability of death over age, and I'm going to compare it to low, middle, upper middle and high income countries. And you can see, even though we're in a developed country such as Australia, where we should have equal access and universal healthcare systems, that Indigenous people don't experience the same probability of death over time. And you can see that it's probably most comparable to low middle income countries. This slide will then look at the non-Indigenous population. And again, Valerie sort of mentioned that the non-Indigenous, or the Australian population overall experiences very good health. And I also wanted to acknowledge Mike Daub for some of the work he's done leading tobacco control over the last 30 or so years, or plus. I won't go into too much detail, but I think you've seen some significant decreases in smoking that are reflected in such a good or low mortality rate. So when we compare the non-Indigenous population, you can see that they actually have a better probability of death over time than the average high-income countries. So we're looking at some significant differences within Australia. Again, I've tried to unpack this a little bit and looking at the world population and looking at the average probability of death, which Valerie also showed, and again comparing it to the non-Indigenous and Indigenous population. I then sort of tried to unpack it at certain age groups, I guess. We know that the reason that people die in various ages are predominantly due to very different reasons. So when we look at it at the age of 25, We can see across the world that it's a 7% rate probability. When we look at the Indigenous population, it's, God, I need a new script on my glasses. We have 4%, and then the non-Indigenous 2%. So again, still significantly different, but comparable to most high-income countries. And then when we look at 65 years, we have Indigenous Australians at around 30%, the world around 25%, and again, the non-Indigenous population just under 10%. So why is this so? Why do we have these rates? And we looked at unpacking that, and we looked at the leading causes of death among Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And the 4 leading causes of death all have a causal relationship with tobacco use. Some may find that surprising, others may not. And when we look at Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tobacco use, we can see it doesn't matter how you cut it across the age group, that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have disproportionately high rates of tobacco use for a whole range of reasons. I should also just take a quick moment to pause here and also to acknowledge and thank Professor Tom Calmer for his work in this space, and also for his work on this presentation today and on this research. Unfortunately, I had a prior commitment, so you guys are stuck with me. But he has done a lot of work around this, and some of his early work in the 2005 Social Justice Commissioner's report was able to identify that tobacco was a very large cause of premature mortality among Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and something we can change. So I did want to give Tom a shout out. So we took that into consideration, and we looked at smoking prevalence, and we looked at relative risk ratios from Emily Banks and the 45 and up study. And what we found when we looked at it by smoking and non-smoking was that Indigenous smokers had, again, extremely high rate of probability of death in comparison to Indigenous non-smokers. And we found that it was comparable to low-income countries in comparison to high-income countries. So essentially, and what I just want to take a real moment to pause and sort of understand this slide, is it's sort of suggesting that Indigenous smokers are comparable to a low-income country, and that we sort of are facing, in some ways, some low-income challenges in a developed country with again, universal healthcare system. I did also want to point out, and I sort of alluded to this a little bit when we looked at the 25-year probability of death, that the line is, and the trend is quite different. So you do see, when you're looking at low-income countries, that there is, at the younger ages, quite a high rate of probability of death in comparison to the Indigenous smokers and non-smokers. So there are some differences across the lifespan, and we need to consider that. So sort of coming towards a summary or the conclusion of this, we know among Indigenous Australians, approximately 1 in 3 deaths before age 65, premature deaths, is due to smoking. And we also know that by the age of 65, again, premature deaths in around 2010, 25% worldwide. We're looking at about 40% among low-income countries, 30% among Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and then we break that down and look at it by smoking and non-smoking. We're looking at 42% for Indigenous smokers and around 22% for Indigenous non-smokers, and then non-Indigenous Australians are doing exceptionally well, and everyone here should give themselves a pat on the back for the great work that's been undertaken. So the risk of premature death is similar to that of middle low-income countries. Again, I'm just trying to reiterate what I think some of the key points are out of this. Smoking is a single major risk factor contributing to excess premature mortality, again accounting for 1 in 3 premature deaths. And again, similar to low middle income countries or low income countries when we're looking at just Indigenous smokers. And I did want to emphasise that this is actually a good news story, although it seems very bleak and somewhat depressing. But smoking is 100% preventable, so if we can prevent 1 in every 3 deaths, I think we're doing a good job. So I shouldn't be discouraged by this, and just wanted to acknowledge that great work has been undertaken and will continue to be undertaken in this space. That's it for me.
So Raglan, thank you very much. That really presented the evidence in a very stark way. What I think is quite interesting is that when people talk about differentials in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, they tend to frame it in terms of average life expectancy. And it struck me that in some ways underestimates, or sort of it's a very derived figure. And I just wanted to hear your opinion about the statistics that are generally used and how they differ from the statistics that you've just presented to us, and the ways in which these types of figures can be used for policy.
Yeah, good question, Emily. I think when we sat down and we started sort of trying to explore that, I think that the life expectancy and the Close the Gap campaign has done an exceptional job in raising this social justice issue, really. And I think that it should continue to be used. I don't think there's necessarily flaws in that, but it's not necessarily the be-all and end-all to it. I think there are components where we have had exceptional improvements in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health and well-being since the 1970s, probably. But sometimes we do, if we're looking at something like life expectancy and we're looking at those sort of calculations, we do sometimes mask some of the downsides as well as some of the benefits. So I think if we can sort of unpack it as best we can, and I think this is one way of doing it, then we can possibly better target some of those programs and policies. I think you also see that there are some significant differences. I think there's been some great improvements, particularly in infant mortality, and we've seen that over the last 10, 20 years probably. And again, I think when you look at it compared to low and middle income countries, the infant mortality rate isn't great for Indigenous people. I'm not saying it is, but it's still comparable to high income countries. Whereas when you start to look at it from 25 to 65, we're then comparing ourselves to low and middle income countries, which is also not ideal, but again, it's a different level of, a different challenge that we have to face. So we do have to consider these. Hope that answers your question, but always happy to chat. Thanks, Emily. Any other questions? One more slide.
Okay, yes, if you can see better than me, I'll sit down.
Thank you, Raglan, for the excellent presentation. Nathan Grills from the Knoxville University of Melbourne. Quick question about the rapid increase in the Indigenous smoking rates. Like you see in that slide you had, there's a slow increase in the low middle income countries, but there's quite a rapid increase in the last 30 years in Indigenous communities. Do you want to actually a bit more light on why that's the case?
No, I'm hoping that you might have misread the slide. So the smoking rate was across age, so it had from around 15 or 17 years of age. Are you talking about the slide that went like this, like a? Yeah. So it was by age, and then in comparison to smoking. So we actually have seen, if we're looking at trends over the last 20 years, smoking rates were pretty stagnant, around 50% for a long time, and we've now seen, probably since the Close the Gap and Closing the Gap campaigns, and the work that's been implemented around tackling Indigenous smoking around 2008, 2010, that there are some significant declines since then, and we're down to about 42%. And there's a great paper actually coming out looking at that in hopefully the near future, so keep your eye out for that one, out of Emily Banks's team. Self-promotion as well.
Is it the same approaches that are working in the mainstream, or is it different approaches that seem to be working?
It's a little bit different, I think. I think there's a few answers to that. I think we know in tobacco control that there's no silver bullet, and that overnight success comes slowly. To steal some quotes from Mike Daub. I think that the mainstream tobacco reduction, tobacco control work has an impact on Indigenous populations, but it in some ways can be very, very different in comparison to the general population. The history of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with tobacco use means that it's somewhat entrenched. Payment of tobacco in rations prior to the cash economy in the 60s is still very recent in living memory for a lot of people, and so trying to change that social norm is very different. And so we have seen local community approaches and engaging with Aboriginal people to be, I guess in some ways, fast-tracking some of that work. And I think the lessons that we've learnt from the mainstream population and starting to implement Indigenous communities with a local focus is going to hopefully see a continued decline in tobacco prevalence. Thanks, Nathan. Can I steal one more question?
Is there? Yes,
Yeah,
if there's one
sorry.
more and then we'll last one.
It's on. My name's Ashton Kelly. I'm an emergency doctor. I just did some work in the Northern Territory. So, Raglan, thanks very much. My question is a quick one. Have you looked at, given the diversity of the Aboriginal population, have you looked at this data by location?
Not particularly. I think there's a few limitations with the national data, and I think location is one of them. We have looked at it around prevalence, and then when you start to look at tobacco prevalence by location, there's a few different stories between urban, rural and remote, and also top-end Australia in comparison to elsewhere. And so we do need to take into that consideration, and I think some of the tobacco reduction work, looking at local context, is really looking to address some of those differences. But in this case, I guess the scope was to try and look at the framing of, for example, the life expectancy question and try and understand that a little bit better. But happy to talk to you about that offline, and if you want to chat more in the break. Thanks, guys.